I apologize to some people in the room who have heard me more or less present this earlier in the week at a different workshop. It's based on a paper that's a draft chapter at the moment for a CRIMT project book that's really focused upon unions at work and in regions, unions at work in regions and sectors. And my paper, my sector is automotive assembly, so similar to what Todd and Lorenzo presented. My region is what I call the Great Lakes region. So it's Ontario plus the Great Lakes states, because this operates as a fully functionally integrated production region. And I think it's interesting because production is so highly integrated within this cross-international border region, and yet we're faced with two nationally based unions that represent workers within this industry. The paper is quite descriptive. It's a longitudinal descriptive narrative. Which means it's not easy to present in a short period of time. So I'm not going to try to get bogged down in the details. I'm just going to try to pull out some of the main points that I try to make in the paper. The auto industry, the Canadian auto industry, is clearly and it's still an important manufacturing industry. There are some still parts of the industry in Quebec, but essentially it's a Southern Ontario industry, and not just Southern Ontario, but in a very concentrated geographical corridor between Toronto and Windsor, Detroit. So what are the themes? What's the paper about? As I say, in a sense, it's about a cross-border region and sectoral collective bargaining within the context of a cross-border region. It's looking at an industry that has sustained a number of very significant external shocks over the past 15, 20 years, and yet the region has stayed the industry within the region, despite a lot of what you see in the media, has stayed very resilient. I mean, the region as a whole still accounts for roughly 60% of all vehicle production in North America, over 50% of production of engines, transmissions, etc., and employs over 500,000 workers. So it is still resilient within the region. The two external shocks that really kind of feature in my narrative are the 2008-2009 crisis and the bankruptcies of GM and Chrysler, but also, and I really stress this in the paper, it's the rise of these competing automotive producing regions within North America. I mean, the rise, the very spectacular rise of assembly capacity in Mexico, as a low labor cost area, but also the emergence of a major automotive producing region in the American South, which is, in that region, the industry is essentially non-union, Asian and European owned. So this has set up tremendous inter-regional and intra-regional competition for new investment. Within North America, there's a competition between the Great Lakes region versus American South versus Mexico, but then within the Great Lakes region, between Ontario and the Great Lakes states. And this sets up some interesting policy issues as well, because on the one hand, Ontario really does have a stake in seeing the Great Lakes region as a whole prosper versus the American South and Mexico. And yet within the region, we're in competition for investment with Michigan or Ohio, etc. One of the other themes in the paper is looking at the way in which the bargaining demands made by the Canadian Union, CAW Unifor, really shift over the course of this period from a focus on wages, benefits and production standards, and I think here there's some connection back again to Todd and Lorenzo's paper, and it shifts away from that to a focus on trying to secure investment commitments to save work. At the same time, within the broader Great Lakes region, because of the pressure of competition and a variety of factors that come into play, we have the development of tiered wages within this industry. And the tiered wages really have a very significant impact on solidarity within the unions. So it's really a story about how automotive manufacturing remains resilient in the Great Lakes region, largely as a result of the transformation over a fairly short period of time of one of the key institutional pillars of the region, and that's the automotive labor relations system. And as an outcome of collective bargaining within this sector since 2000, we've seen a recalibration of labor relations in the region, a resetting of labor costs, a downward resetting of labor costs, which in turn has restored the competitiveness of the Great Lakes region within North America. In the paper, I do focus a fair bit on the impact of the 2016 round of negotiations between Unifor and the Detroit Three, and what impact that has on had on the competitive position of the industry in Canada. But I do that in the context of UAW-CAW bargaining since 2000. Okay, I mean, this is sort of general. I think a lot of people in the room would be fully aware of this, that before 1985, we've got an industry where assembly is 100% union. There's one union representing workers in both countries. There's a system of a highly a standardized system of pattern and collective bargaining across the industry with a highly uniform pattern of wages, benefits, etc. After 1985, Canadian auto workers leave the UAW, form the CAW, collective agreement provisions diverge. The pattern tends to remain in Canada, but really breaks down in the US. And don't have time to go through this, but I mean, this is simply, by 2015 where the US is at. And I draw attention to the very last bullet in this list, where by that time there was significant two-tier labor within this industry, not just temporary, but two-tier, permanent two-tier. And at Fiat Chrysler, it was as much as 45% of the labor force in the assembly sector. So in the paper, I talk about two waves of concession bargaining because the industry did extraordinarily well during the 1990s. And in fact, the agreements that were signed in 1999 were the richest that had ever been signed in the industry. And then after the turn of the millennium, that marks a real watershed in terms of labor relations in this industry. So the two waves here, the first is sort of earlier 70s and 80s, which was largely seen to be more temporary and extraordinary. But in the paper, I really focus upon what I call this second wave of ultra-concessionary bargaining, during which we see the introduction of tiered wages and benefits. And in the paper, I sequentially work through these various rounds of bargaining, both in the US and in Canada, pointing out how these concessions gradually weaken the role of the union. Two quite striking things, events. I mean, first of all, in the 2008-9 crisis, in the US, GM had already bargained with the UAW concessions, and yet the Obama administration refused to accept those. And as you can see in this quotation this is a quotation from the UAW, that the Treasury in the US actually moved into GM headquarters to tell them what had to still be done, even though concessions had already been bargained. And this is a quotation from CAW staff person reflecting back on the 2012 negotiations, saying that the automakers insisted that we had to follow the UAW two-tier system, else we'd absolutely have no new investment. So 2016 becomes a really pivotal moment for the Ontario auto industry. Paramount issue for union is securing new OEM investment, especially for 3 plants which were really seen to be under tremendous pressure and have an uncertain future. GM Oshawa Assembly, Brampton Assembly for Chrysler, and the Ford engine plants. Ontario's competitive cost advantage had really been eroded, and I argue in the paper that a large part of that is these transformational labor agreements that had occurred in the US, which had introduced two-tier wages and really reduced labor costs in the US segment of the industry. Okay. So I go in the paper, I go through, I look at the context for those negotiations, the bargaining objectives, the market condition. The market conditions were amazing. I mean, there were record levels of sales and production. The Canadian dollar had weakened since 2012, and so the union should have been in a fairly strong position to bargain. The order of I then go through the actual process. Somewhat surprisingly, CAW chose GM as the first target to set the pattern. And there was, I set out there the economic pattern, which was then, I mean, the pattern still exists in Canada. That was then subsequently accepted at Ford and Fiat Chrysler. There was new investment commitments. Bargaining in each case went right down to the strike deadline. I mean, it was really 12th hour. But in the end, there were commitments. The last couple of slides is just sort of a kind of trying to pull out some of an assessment of this, that on the surface, Unifor appeared to achieve its prime objective of getting renewed investment in those plants, but questions really remain about the nature of at least 2 of those investments, especially the one at Oshawa. The union couldn't reduce what had become the 10-year grow-in for new hires, which in a sense is two-tier in the Canadian context. This is it shouldn't read 2916, it should be 2016. Okay, not that far into the future. Okay, it maintained the economic pattern across companies in Canada. Represented a real departure for the union in terms of bargaining for investment being the prime demand. It enabled the companies to hold the line on labour costs. And labour costs for the Great Lakes region as a whole over this period, I argue that it has remained resilient in auto manufacturing largely because labour costs have been significantly lowered through concession bargaining, which has had a tremendous impact. It's resulted in resilience for the industry in the region, but at a real cost to workers. And so it really raises some critical questions about resilience for whom and under what conditions. That's it. Thanks.